Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of today's show here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and it's another NFL Awards check-in in terms of betting odds, Offensive Player of the Year award specifically. And this is perhaps the most thrilling race to watch on the stretch here because it could be considered the pity award, let's say, because the top two guys are definitely MVP caliber players and they deserve to be MVP candidates. But ultimately, as we all know, the MVP doesn't necessarily mean it extends to certain other positions. And it's ultimately going to be a quarterback, I believe, who wins that award. But that quarterback does deserve it. But potentially in this race, we see one of these quote-unquote running back MVP candidates actually win in a meaningful award. So without further ado, let's look into the top 5 betting favorites for this nonetheless prestigious award. Let's start off with number 5, a player who's really come on these past couple of weeks. Really has completely turned his career around with a new home and this new style of play that he's employed for this playoff contender. How about Josh Jacobs at number 5? Plus 6,000 odds, obviously a little too late in terms of potentially winning this award. But what he's done this year to completely turn his career on its head has been nothing short of incredible. And I respect him for his maturity in this Green Bay Packers offense, his development in this Green Bay Packers offense, because ultimately the Packers have historically not necessarily relied too much on the running back position. They've had some great running backs over the past couple of years, and ultimately not necessarily someone this kind of revolutionary for them, this kind of important and integral to the success of their offense. So he completely deserves to be in this conversation. One of the league leaders, I believe he's in the top 5 potentially, if not definitely the top 8 running backs in terms of rush yards this season. So I do feel like his candidacy is warranted and his betting status is warranted. But ultimately, I do feel the fact that these other 2 running backs ahead of him, because of their MVP caliber type seasons that they've been doing all season long for much more run-heavy offenses, come into play here. And that's why he does sit 5th overall in terms of betting perspective. But ultimately, nonetheless, an incredible season for an incredible player in a career year after it seemed like his career was on the downward slope. And so that's why I feel like him being 5th makes so much sense because of what he looked like before the season and the outlook of his career more specifically looked like before the season. So he ultimately deserves, but I don't necessarily think that he's done enough to supplant the other 2 running backs in this race. But nonetheless, a very exciting candidate that I was really excited to see on this list. Hopefully he doesn't go off against us though. Then number 4, obviously the MVP favorite right now, Josh Allen at plus 2,500. And the fact that he's even 4th in this race just goes to show how incredible of a player he's been, and the season he has had. Because of the fact that, yes, this offense was tailor-made so that he didn't have to do too much. Because of certain injuries, Josh Allen had to become Superman in certain games yet again, and he's done it in spades. He's had less stinky-like games, or stinkers as we call them here at the GSMC Podcast Network, but ultimately, he has proven that no matter what style of play the Bills employ week in, week out, that he can play fundamentally sound within those systems. And his turnovers this season, being completely reduced from where they were last year, have proven that. Because part and parcel as to why he's never won an MVP award to this date has been because of those turnovers. Because we know how incredible he is, but the fact that he is so turnover prone kind of limited his MVP candidacies over the past couple of years. But now, the fact that he's only thrown 5 picks, not necessarily fumbled the football this much this year, proves that he's a viable contender on both fronts, and both the MVP and Offensive Player of the Year. With that being said, a quarterback can't win both awards this season, sadly, even though he definitely could, and it would prove that he'd become the face of the league, because I do think he is right now. But the other 3 guys, certainly because of the fact that the NFL has to award these positions somehow, get better status than him in terms of the betting perspectives so far. But he still remains in this list as a viable contender on both fronts, and it's shocking to see a quarterback rated this highly for an Offensive Player of the Year award this year. Number 3, a guy who you have to put in, even though his team has not performed consistently this season. Ja'Marr Chase, only wide receiver right now over 1,100 receiving yards this season. That's incredible. CeeDee Lamb, the second leading receiver in the league, shockingly as well, and could potentially be a contender on this front as well in another bad offense this year. The only receiver over 900 even. So that's unheard of, the fact that Ja'Marr Chase has so separated himself from the pack. But ultimately, at plus 1,600, I feel like if this season were a little bit more consistent for Cincinnati, maybe not even to the point where they're playoff contenders, maybe that they're a 9-8 football team in the periphery of the playoffs, which they still could be, but I don't necessarily see it down the stretch, then he definitely could have won the award. But he's sitting behind two very special running backs, that have defined our generation and really have proven that they deserve this award over these other candidates. And so I can't really see a world where Ja'Marr Chase makes a last-minute surge here, unless, they do win out and somehow, some way, miraculously sneak into the postseason, which I don't really see happening. But ultimately, Ja'Marr Chase deserves credit for the season, deserves his flowers, even though his season is being wasted, as well as Joe Burrow's. Because if not, then both of these guys will be definitely worthy of MVP and Offensive Player of the Year candidacy. But ultimately, they might just get one award out of this season, which is Comeback Player of the Year award for Joe Burrow, in my opinion. But ultimately, you can't discredit outstanding offensive output this year from this guy. And even though he's not going to win the award, I do feel like he deserves to be, at least in the conversation. Because you have to acknowledge the league's leading receiver year in, year out for their performance, no matter their record, no matter their status. And so that's why Ja'Marr Chase should find himself in an advantageous position in this award race, but not necessarily as the front runner. Then number 2 here, a guy who I feel like could have moved down the ranks a little bit. Definitely still very much in this race, but ultimately has kind of lost his luster these past couple of weeks with Derrick Henry at plus 420. Now, Derrick Henry was someone who, before the season, I completely misdiagnosed in his transition to Baltimore. Because at 30 years of age, I thought he was going to negatively impact this team as a quote-unquote defined running back, when in fact I liked the more committee approach they had when Dobbins and Edwards were there, but he has proved me wrong in spades. But the reason why he sits behind Saquon in this race is because of the fact that Baltimore doesn't necessarily utilize him through the entirety of a game, if that makes much sense. Because I feel like Baltimore, much more so than Philly, can utilize Lamar Jackson's deep ball threat. They definitely have, I believe, worse receivers than Philly, which kind of leads to the point that Saquon leads this race hands down. But ultimately, what Derrick Henry has done in a little bit more pass-heavy offense there in Baltimore this season is nothing short of incredible. And that's why he sits at number 2. But because of the fact they don't necessarily implement him in their game plan as often and as wholeheartedly and well-rounded as Saquon, that holds him back. Because when I think of running backs who win this award, yes, they've been dominant. Yes, you think of guys like Sean Alexander, Adrian Peterson of bygone eras, maybe even an Eric Dickerson if we go that far back. But ultimately, the reason why Derrick Henry is not going to win this award is because, surprisingly, a run-heavy team only utilizes him in weird situations, right? When they're already up, or, when they feel like they've already beaten a defense and already overwhelmed them with their play. And it's a good thing that Derrick Henry is getting meaningful touches sometimes, but it doesn't help his candidacy when he's not, quote-unquote, the whole offense, much like the number 1 candidate for this award is Saquon Barkley. And minus 470, the overwhelming betting favorite in this department. He deserves it. But, my only caveat with Saquon is the fact that in this offense, he kind of feels like he should be a bit more bolstered by Jalen Hurts. And when I look at the past couple of weeks, where Jalen Hurts has time and time again not necessarily showed up in the past game, I feel like the fact that he's not complimenting the best of Saquon Barkley, the fact that Saquon is doing everything himself, the fact that Saquon is going to put up a historic season potentially, kind of hinders his candidacy here, and potentially his candidacy as an MVP as well. Because if Jalen Hurts only plays a little bit better, chances are Saquon's season gets made even more relevant than it already is, if that shocks a lot of people. Because it's already one of the more historic running back seasons in Eagles franchise history, potentially all time, that we've ever seen. But it all comes down to the fact that Jalen Hurts might be holding him back. And that's the only reason as to why he potentially misses out on both awards, even though in this one he should handily win this one. Make no mistakes about it. That's the only thing that arises in my mind when thinking of one true caveat that could keep him away from winning both awards. But that being said, he ultimately is going to win this award because it potentially can be his quote-unquote pity award that he wins this season. But ultimately, let me know what you think about this award in the comments, because it could come down to that, It could come down to Hurts' shoddy play. But that will just about do it for the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow to conclude the week here on the show at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe if you haven't already to both the show and the network. Continue making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, see you tomorrow. I am out for today.